So in this tutorial we'll be looking at what exactly sponsorship is, and we'll also look at the advantages and disadvantages of sponsorship for the individual or the team, for the sport, and indeed for the business or organisation which is sponsoring. So the first question then is, what is sponsorship? And we can see here that we can regard sponsorship as being a business arrangement or agreement between a company and an individual, club or event in which the company supports the club or individual, usually by providing money and equipment. Now in return, the company expects to receive some kind of commercial benefit from the arrangement. An example of this might be Nike and Tiger Woods have this agreement, or another example might be David Beckham with Adidas. Now there are a number of questions that you might be asked about sport and sponsorship, one of which is this one in front of you, which is, what advantages are there to a performer being sponsored? So in this case we're talking about the performer being sponsored, and we can see there are a number of benefits or potential benefits for the performer. The performer receives sports goods, equipment and money from the sponsor. This means that the performer can focus fully on training and competing, and they don't have to worry about finding money in other ways or having to find a job in order to support themselves. Now another way you could be asked about sport and sponsorship is where the question focuses on the benefits for the business or the company that's actually involved in the sponsorship. So this question here asks, what advantages are there to a business or a company being involved in sports sponsorship? And again, with regards to businesses or companies sponsoring sport, there are a number of benefits or potential benefits. So for example, if the performer, club or event is successful, the sponsor will be associated with success. Success attracts media attention, which means that many people will see the sponsor's name and the logo, and they may well buy the company's products or services. And this brings in more money and more exposure to the company. And the third way you might be asked about sport and sponsorship is actually looking at the sport itself. So in this case, what advantages are there to a sport or an activity if it is sponsored? So a response to a question which asks about the benefits of a sport being sponsored may include some of the following. So sponsorship brings money into the sport, which can lead to better equipment, better facilities, and a higher standard of coaching, as well as a higher standard of play, which then therefore may raise the profile of the sport. Now, as well as looking at the advantages and the positive sides of sport sponsorship, we also need to look at the disadvantages and what the potential problems are with sports sponsorship. So we might get a question like this: what disadvantages are there to a performer being sponsored? So in this case, if we're looking at the disadvantages of sports sponsorship for the individual, we might want to be looking at some of the following. We might want to say the sponsor, i.e. the company or the business that's sponsoring the performer, can demand a lot of the performer's time for media events and in order for them to promote their products. This can interfere with training and sometimes put huge pressure on the performer, particularly if the sponsor expects positive winning results all of the time. Now there can also be disadvantages to the business or the company that's actually involved in the sponsorship, and we need to make sure that we're able to answer that question as well. So we might get a question like this: what disadvantages are there to a business or a company being involved in sports sponsorship? And in response to a question about the disadvantages for the company or business in sports sponsorship, we might look to bring in some of these following points. So if the performer, the club or the event is unsuccessful, the sponsor will be associated with failure. Failure does not attract as much media attention as success, and therefore companies will not make much money and they won't have as much exposure from the deal. Also, and this has happened in the recent past, if a performer is found cheating or taking drugs or has disgraced himself in some way, this can bring a bad reputation to the sponsor if they're associated with that sports individual. And the final area that you could be asked about with regard to sport and sponsorship is, what are the disadvantages to the sport itself, or indeed an activity, if it is sponsored? So this can be a real disadvantage to sports when they are sponsored. because big companies can start or may start to demand how and when the sport's played. And this is particularly true when sport is on TV with millions of people watching. For example, big sports events usually take place at prime TV viewing time, even if it's not the best time for the event to be held for the competitors.